In September 1939, the world precipitated toward the greatest conflict in history. In a matter of days, millions of men were mobilized and European borders began to collapse under German military force. War did not emerge from nothing, but from calculated decisions and chain of provocations that could not be stopped. The beginning was direct and brutal. Poland's invasion was executed with tactics of speed and power known as blitzkrieg. Tanks, planes, and troops advanced in perfect coordination, devastating defenses and sowing terror in few hours. European powers, tied by pacts and commitments, responded by declaring war on Germany. Global conflict had begun. Was Poland's invasion really the cause of the beginning, or was war already decided much earlier? What hidden factors explain why World War II really began? The wounds of the Great War, the Treaty of Versailles, and German humiliation. On November 11, 1918, in a wagon stopped in Compiègne Forest, the armistice that ended 4 years of war was signed. Bells resonated in Allied capitals, but in German trenches the news was received with bewilderment. Lines had not collapsed completely, and no enemy soldier marched yet through the heart of German territory. However, High Command ordered retreat like a defeated army. Confusion soon transformed into resentment. Generals like Erich von Ludendorff and Paul von Hindenburg spread the idea that the army had remained undefeated at the front, and that surrender had come through betrayal by politicians, socialists, and Jews. This narrative of the stab in the back became a powerful myth that would mark German political life during post-war. Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. In Berlin, Social Democrats proclaimed the Weimar Republic, a democratic regime that was born under extremely adverse conditions. Streets were taken by communist demonstrations inspired by Russian Revolution, while right-wing paramilitary groups responded with violence. The young republic had to negotiate peace with victors while attempting to contain social and economic collapse. For the Allies, there was no space for indulgence. France had suffered devastation in its own territory during 4 years of trench warfare, with razed cities, millions of hectares of agricultural lands made useless, and more than 1 million dead. Great Britain also demanded punishment. German blockade had put at risk supply of the islands, while gas attacks and aerial bombardments had altered traditional combat rules. Public opinions in Paris and London demanded integral reparations. In June 1919, German delegates were summoned to Palace of Versailles. The place evoked proclamation of German Empire in 1871, now resignified as scene of humiliation. Treaty imposed 440 articles that transformed Germany's position in Europe. Article 231 declared Germany and its allies responsible for war and all derived damages, establishing legal base for unprecedented reparations. Inter-Allied Reparations Commission fixed debt at 132 billion gold marks, an exorbitant sum. Payments were demanded in cash and in kind: coal, steel, chemical products, ships, livestock, and even works of art. France claimed 16 million tons of coal annually, figure that represented more than a quarter of German production. Economy, weakened by war, was not in conditions to support these burdens without collapsing. British economist John Maynard Keynes resigned in protest, qualifying treaty as catastrophic error, although his warnings were ignored. Territorial losses accompanied economic pressure. Alsace-Lorraine was returned to France. Saar remained under international administration, with its coal production assigned to France. Polish corridor separated East Prussia from rest of country. Danzig transformed into free city under international tutelage, and Upper Silesia was divided, delivering to Poland richest industrial zones. In total, Germany lost more than 10% of its population, 13% of its European territory, and areas that concentrated majority of its iron production and quarter of its coal. Military limitations completed suffocation. Army was reduced to 100,000 men, without obligatory service, without heavy artillery, without tanks, without aviation, and without chemical weapons. Navy remained restricted to few obsolete vessels, without submarines. Rhineland was declared demilitarized zone, prohibiting presence of German troops. For a nation whose identity had been forged around Prussian military tradition, these restrictions proved humiliating. On June 28, 1919, date of 5th anniversary of Archduke's assassination in Sarajevo, treaty was signed. German delegates did so under protest, qualifying it as dictate imposed by force. In Germany, they were received as traitors, and document came to symbolize national humiliation. Reparations compliance proved impossible from beginning. In 1922, Berlin requested moratorium. French response was to militarily occupy Ruhr in January 1923 with Belgian support. German government responded with passive resistance, general strikes in mines and factories, accompanied by massive printing of paper money to sustain strikers. This unleashed unprecedented hyperinflation. Prices multiplied throughout day. Salaries were paid twice daily so families could spend money before it lost value. $1, which before war was equivalent to few marks, came to be exchanged for billions in November 1923. Savings of entire generations disappeared in matter of weeks, and middle class, which traditionally had sustained political order, was ruined. Confidence in Weimar Republic collapsed. Treaty of Versailles became symbol of all misfortunes. In cafes, universities and newspapers, the idea was repeated that Germany had been unjustly dispossessed. Rhineland demilitarization, loss of African colonies and army reduction were interpreted not as security measures for allies, but as affronts to national honor. In classrooms, children learned that their country had been punished disproportionately. In public discourse, image of people victim of international conspiracy was consolidated. Crisis of 1929 aggravated everything. Unemployment exceeded 6 million, bankruptcies multiplied, and political polarization deepened. Parties that had accepted Versailles lost credibility, while those who promised its destruction gained space. In Munich, Austrian veteran named Adolf Hitler connected defeat, reparations, hyperinflation, and world crisis in narrative that pointed to internal and external culprits. His discourse offered not only explanation of German humiliation, but also promise of future redemption. The world without guardians, the impotence of the League of Nations. In December 1918, American President Woodrow Wilson arrived in Europe convinced that it was possible to found different world order. His central proposal was creation of League of Nations, organization charged with resolving international disputes through diplomacy and guaranteeing that Great War sacrifices would not be repeated. Idea was received with hope in societies exhausted by destruction, and in 1920 institution was established in Geneva. Its mandate included preserving peace, supervising colonial mandates, and promoting international cooperation. From its origins, structure revealed profound limitations. Important decisions required unanimity in council, which granted veto power to any member. Organization did not count on its own armed forces and depended on states' will to apply sanctions or coercive measures. More decisive still was that United States never came to integrate into institution designed by its own president. American Senate rejected adhesion, fearing it would compromise national sovereignty in future wars. American absence left organizations wait in the hands of France and Great Britain, weakened powers without disposition to commit more resources to new military obligations. Both faced economic crises, colonial tensions, and societies traumatized by human losses. During decade of 1920s, League functioned acceptably in minor disputes, supervised plebiscites in border regions, and resolved conflicts between small countries. However, these limited successes did not test its capacity against powers determined to challenge international order. First great crisis came from Asia. Japan had emerged from war as expanding industrial power, but with insufficient natural resources. Its population grew rapidly, and dependence on imports of coal, iron, oil, and food was considered unsustainable by military planners. Manchuria region, rich in resources and with railways under Japanese influence since Russo-Japanese War, seemed to offer solution. During the 20s, army officers stationed in zone operated with growing autonomy regarding civil government in Tokyo. On September 18, 1931, Japanese officers organized minor explosion on railway near Mukden, accused Chinese saboteurs, and used it as pretext to occupy city. In few months, Japanese troops controlled all Manchuria and proclaimed puppet state of Manchukuo under figure of former Emperor Puyi. China appealed to League of Nations, but response was slow. Commission headed by Lord Lytton was designated, which took more than a year to present conclusions. In that time, Japan consolidated its control. report, published in October 1932, recognized Japanese interests in region but concluded that invasion could not be justified as self-defense. In February 1933, Assembly approved report by broad majority. Japan reacted by abandoning Hall and shortly after, League itself. Tokyo declared it would not accept resolutions about Manchuria. Organization remained openly challenged for the first time, without response capacity. Neither France nor Great Britain were disposed to impose economic sanctions that could affect their trade in Asia, much less to contemplate military action in Pacific. United States, although it denounced aggression, was not member and remained on sidelines. Message was clear: important power could break international law without real consequences. While Japan strengthened its dominion in Asia, Italy sought its own expansion. Benito Mussolini, in power since 1922, had promised to restore imperial greatness. Economic crisis of Great Depression led him to seek exterior triumph. Ethiopia, then called Abyssinia, was attractive objective, one of few independent African countries, League member since 1923 and symbol of Italian defeat at Adwa in 1896. In December 1934, border clash at Walwal served as pretext. Mussolini demanded apologies and began mobilizing more than 200,000 soldiers from Eritrea and Italian Somalia. Emperor Haile Selassie appealed directly to League, recalling promise of collective security. In October 1935, Italy initiated invasion. Abyssinian army, with outdated armament and without aviation, could not resist. Campaign was marked by massive use of mustard gas and bombings over hospitals and civilian populations. In May 1936, Addis Ababa fell and Italian East Africa was proclaimed. League acted faster than in Manchuria, condemning aggression and imposing economic sanctions in October 1935. But measures were incomplete. Oil sale was not prohibited nor Suez Canal closed under British control. Such measures would have paralyzed campaign, but London and Paris avoided applying them for fear of pushing Mussolini toward closer alliance with Hitler. Result was same. Another attacked member remained without effective protection. In Germany, Hitler followed with attention. Having reached power in January 1933, his program included destruction of Versailles system. In October that same year, Germany abandoned League and Disarmament Conference. Regime had already secretly initiated rearmament program that violated treaty. In March 1935, Hitler publicly announced existence of Luftwaffe and reintroduced obligatory military service, expanding army to 550,000 men. Definitive test came in March 1936 with Rhineland remilitarization. 3 German battalions crossed Rhine in violation of Versailles and Locarno. It was calculated risk. German army was in inferiority and had orders to withdraw if France responded militarily. But Paris, in political crisis, did not react. Great Britain considered that Germany only recovered control over its own territory. League limited itself to verbal condemnations without concrete action. Sequence was clear. Japan had occupied Manchuria, Italy had conquered Ethiopia, and Germany had militarized Rhineland. In each case, League condemned but did not act. Aggressors verified that collective security system lacked force. World had remained without effective guardians, and decade headed toward new war. The rise of dictators, Hitler, Mussolini, and Japan. Weimar Republic had achieved certain stability in second half of 1920s decade thanks to flow of American capital that sustained German industrial recovery. Factories resumed production, unemployment was reduced, and extremist parties retreated. However, this recovery rested on fragile base and depended on international stability. On October 29, 1929, New York Stock Exchange collapse unleashed global crisis that affected Germany with special harshness. Sudden withdrawal of American credits paralyzed industry, banks went bankrupt, and unemployment grew to unprecedented figures. In few years, millions of Germans found themselves without work or savings. Social desperation offered fertile ground for radical discourses. Adolf Hitler, Austrian veteran of Great War, capitalized this conjuncture. After failed coup attempt in Munich in 1923, he had spent brief period in prison where he wrote first volume of Mein Kampf. In its pages, he formulated ideological program that combined anti-Semitism, extreme nationalism, and theory of living space in Eastern Europe. Defeat of 1918, according to his vision, had been consequence of internal conspiracy of Jews, Marxists, and Republican politicians. Released in 1924, Hitler reorganized National Socialist Party under strategy of conquering power through legal means. Organization provided itself with rigid hierarchical structure and auxiliary groupings for different social sectors. SA, directed by Ernst Röhm, were consolidated as mass paramilitary force used to intimidate opponents in streets. Simultaneously, Joseph Goebbels perfected propaganda techniques that transformed rallies into carefully choreographed spectacles with flags, torches, and uniforms. Crisis of early 30s multiplied Nazism's appeal. Hitler promised employment for unemployed, dignity for those who felt humiliated by Versailles, and order against fear of communism. Party gained support from impoverished middle class and worker sectors disenchanted with traditional left. In September 1930 elections, Nazis passed from marginal representation to becoming second parliamentary force. In July 1932 they reached first position, although without absolute majority. Political crisis was resolved in January 1933 with Hitler's appointment as Chancellor by President Paul von Hindenburg. From that moment, new government advanced rapidly. Reichstag fire in February served as pretext to suspend liberties and imprison thousands of communists. In March, Enabling Act granted dictatorial powers to Chancellor. In matter of months, opposition parties were prohibited, unions dissolved, and political life subordinated to Nazi control. Regime consolidation was sustained on centralized repressive apparatus. Gestapo, under Heinrich Himmler, organized surveillance network that reached all social levels. First concentration camps opened for political opponents, while Nuremberg laws of 1935 institutionalized racial discrimination against Jews. At same time, Nazi propaganda, directed by Goebbels from his ministry, monopolized media, glorified Führer, and converted loyalty to leader into absolute principle. Economic recovery reinforced regime legitimacy. Large public works projects like highway construction absorbed unemployed labor. Clandestine and then open rearmament revitalized strategic industries. In few years, unemployment was drastically reduced, and broad sectors of population attributed that improvement to Hitler's direction. While Germany became totalitarian dictatorship, Italy had already transited that path decade earlier. Benito Mussolini had reached power in October 1922 after a period of strikes and political violence that paralyzed parliamentary system. March on Rome, more propaganda gesture than effective military operation, forced King Victor Emmanuel III to charge him with government formation. Once installed in power, Mussolini gradually dismantled democratic institutions. A Turbo Law of 1923 guaranteed parliamentary majorities to fascist party, while assassination of socialist deputy Giacomo Matteotti in 1924 marked beginning of open dictatorship. Most fascist laws of 1925 and 1926 abolished press freedom, illegalized opposition, and established special tribunals for political crimes. Regime consolidated cooperative system in which businessmen and workers remained subjected to state control. Propaganda exalted cult of Duce and idea of new imperial Rome. Mussolini oriented foreign policy toward Mediterranean and African expansion. Ethiopia invasion in 1935 was presented as revenge for Adwa defeat and as confirmation of new fascist power on international stage. In Eastern Asia, Japan followed different path but with similar outcome. Country had fought in World War I on Allied side, obtaining concessions in China and Pacific. However, its industrialization depended on imports of strategic resources like oil, iron, and food. Great Depression hit Japanese economy hard, sinking export prices like silk and generating massive unemployment in countryside. Japanese political system combined parliamentary institutions with imperial monarchy of sacred character. Emperor Hirohito embodied national legitimacy, but army and navy enjoyed autonomy and direct access to his figure, which allowed them to impose strategic decisions without civil control. Economic crisis and growing nationalism strengthened military sectors that promoted territorial expansion as solution to internal problems. In September 1931, Kwantung army officers organized Mukden incident as pretext to occupy Manchuria. Operation success and lukewarm international reaction further weakened civilian politicians. In following years, wave of political assassinations ended moderate leaders, while ultra-nationalist societies acted with impunity. In 1932, Prime Minister Inukai Tsuyoshi was assassinated by naval officers, and civilian power remained definitively subordinated to military commands. Emperor Hirohito, presented as divine figure, legitimized these policies. Education instilled absolute obedience and racial superiority. By 1937, Japan was under almost complete military control. Political parties had been absorbed into single-organization economy oriented toward war production and objective of Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere under Japanese leadership was proclaimed. Large-scale invasion of China that same year confirmed expansionist course. In Europe and Asia, rise of Hitler, Mussolini and Japanese militarism responded to specific circumstances, but converged in same result: establishment of authoritarian regimes disposed to challenge international order built after Great War. Combination of national resentment, economic crisis and liberal democracy weakness opened way to scenario in which revisionist powers began preparing for worldwide conflict. Spain as laboratory, civil war and blitzkrieg rehearsal. Proclamation of Second Spanish Republic in April 1931, after King Alfonso XIII's departure, opened process of profound reforms. New regime promoted separation of church and state, land redistribution, army modernization and public education expansion. However, these transformations found immediate opposition in conservative sectors who perceived threat to their traditional interests. Political polarization was accentuated from first years. Catholic and monarchist right organized in Spanish Confederation of Autonomous Rights, while left fragmented among Republicans, socialists and anarchists with strong implantation in rural and urban regions. Confrontations between mobilized workers and forces of order eroded state authority and consolidated climate of constant violence. February 1936 elections gave victory to Popular Front leftist coalition that promised to accelerate reforms. For conservative sectors, that result confirmed risk of Soviet-style revolution. In army, group of officers conspired against government for months. Among them was Francisco Franco, stationed in Canaries to distance him from power centers who awaited propitious moment to act. On July 17, 1936, Spanish garrisons in Morocco rebelled. Next day, Franco joined uprising and Spain remained divided in two zones: Republican, with control over Madrid, Barcelona, Valencia, and most of northern industrial strip, and nationalist, with dominion over ample regions of Peninsula Center and South. Franco's situation was critical. His best troops, Moroccan regulars and legion, were blocked in Africa by Republican navy. To transfer them to Peninsula, he requested direct help from Germany. Hitler acceded rapidly, sending transport planes that established first large-scale military airlift in history. Operation allowed transferring thousands of soldiers to Seville and consolidating southern front. German intervention responded to strategic interests. Conflict offered possibility of testing modern armament in combat, training officers and creating Mediterranean ally. With that objective, Berlin sent Condor Legion, which integrated Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters, Junkers Ju-87 dive bombers and tactical observation units. These forces experimented close air support techniques, selective bombing and psychological operations that would later be applied in Poland and France. Most significant attack occurred on April 26, 1937 in Guernica. For several hours, German and Italian planes bombed Basque City with explosives and incendiary ammunition. Objective was not military but experimental: test urban destruction methods and measure effects of aerial terror on civilian population. Results were studied minutely and served as base for lightning war doctrine. Italy also intervened massively. Mussolini sent Corpo Truppe Volontarie, force of tens of thousands of regular soldiers, with artillery, armor, and hundreds of planes. Italian participation pursued similar goals to Germany's: train troops, validate war material, and strengthen Mediterranean position. For Mussolini, Spanish war also offered opportunity to exhibit fascist power against France and consolidate related regime in Madrid. Western democracies adopted non-intervention policy. Great Britain and France, fearful of escalation toward general war, prohibited sending weapons to any side. In practice, this neutrality favored nationalists, who received sustained military support from Germany and Italy, while legitimate government remained without access to comparable supplies. Soviet Union supported Republic in limited and conditioned form. Moscow sent tanks, planes, and military advisors, besides demanding transfer of Bank of Spain gold reserves. This support reinforced communist influence within Popular Front, intensifying tensions with anarchists and independent socialists. In May 1937, these divisions exploded in Barcelona in open confrontations that gravely weakened Republican side. International brigades, formed by about 30,000 volunteers from dozens of countries, represented most visible effort of foreign solidarity with Republic. However, lack of training and scarcity of modern material limited their impact on front. Nationalist material advantage became evident in 1938 campaigns. Aragon offensive divided Republican territory in two and confirmed effectiveness of coordination between artillery, armor, and aviation. Barcelona fell in January 1939, provoking exodus of hundreds of thousands of refugees toward France. Madrid resisted until end of March, when military junta negotiated surrender to avoid greater destruction. On April 1, 1939, Franco proclaimed war's end. Spain had served as laboratory for fascist powers. Germany had tested weapons and tactics that would perfect blitzkrieg. Italy had deployed forces in real war conditions, and Western democracies had shown their reluctance to intervene, precedent that would have decisive consequences at World War II's beginning. Appeasement, Chamberlain against Nazi expansionism. Franco's victory in Spanish Civil War coincided with decisive turn in Adolf Hitler's foreign policy. After 5 years concentrated on consolidating internal power and secretly reconstructing armed forces, Nazi regime was prepared in 1938 to move to open action. Hitler had promised from his first speeches that Germany would break Versailles chains and reclaim its place as dominant power in Europe. With economy stabilized, unemployment reduced, and Wehrmacht modernized, he considered moment had arrived to advance. First objective was Austria, his native country. Since Nazi rise in Germany, Austrian National Socialist Party had intensified its activities, claiming union with Reich and organizing demonstrations that challenged Vienna government authority. Chancellor Kurt von Schuschnigg tried to maintain independence through balance policy between Berlin and Western powers, but his resources were limited. German pressure increased each month, and in February 1938, Schuschnigg was summoned to Berchtesgaden, where Hitler received him at his Alpine residence. Meeting was, in practice, ultimatum. Hitler demanded incorporation of Nazis in Austrian government, total freedom for National Socialist Party political activity, and subordination of Vienna's foreign policy to Berlin's. Schuschnigg partially accepted, but upon returning to his country tried to recover political margin. On March 9th, he announced plebiscite to decide Austria's future. Consultation was scheduled for March 13th, and question was formulated in terms that favored independence. Are you in favor of free, independent, social, and Christian Austria? Hitler reacted immediately. On March 11th, he presented ultimatum that demanded consultation cancellation and Schuschnigg's resignation. Upon his refusal, German troops received order to cross border. On March 12, 1938, Wehrmacht entered Austria without military resistance. Vienna streets filled with crowds cheering Hitler, although visible enthusiasm did not necessarily represent entire population. Next day, Hitler officially proclaimed annexation. Anschluss incorporated 7 million inhabitants and valuable economic resources to Reich, including central bank gold reserves. Referendum Hitler had prevented was celebrated anyway, but under German control. With ballots designed to favor affirmative vote and in intimidation climate, official result proclaimed 99% support for union. Abroad, reaction was minimal. France and Great Britain protested formally but took no practical measures. Chamberlain declared in Parliament that although he lamented employed methods, union of Germany and Austria responded to historical affinities that made fusion inevitable. International passivity sent Hitler unequivocal signal. He could alter European map without firing single shot. Next step was Czechoslovakia. State emerged after World War I that brought together Czech, Slovak, Hungarian and German populations. In Sudeten border region lived more than 3 million Germans who had remained separated from Austria after Austro-Hungarian Empire collapse. Hitler presented them as oppressed community and encouraged Konrad Henlein, leader of Sudeten German Party, to intensify autonomy demands and denounce supposed discriminations. During spring and summer 1938, Berlin deployed growing pressure. Hitler pronounced speeches in which he defended self-determination principle and claimed right of Sudeten Germans to join Reich. Demonstrations organized by Henlein degenerated into riots that destabilized region. Meanwhile, Czechoslovak President Edvard Beneš tried to gain time offering autonomy concessions but refused to accept territorial cession. On paper, Czechoslovakia seemed to have solid defensive position. Its army was well trained and equipped. Sudeten fortifications were considered among Europe's most modern, and military alliances existed with France and Soviet Union. However, political context weakened its position. France lived chronic instability with short-duration governments that did not want to risk war. Soviet Union went through Stalinist purges that had destroyed good part of Red Army officership. And Great Britain, under Chamberlain's leadership, was convinced that essential was to preserve peace at almost any price. In September 1938, Chamberlain decided to intervene personally. At 69 years old, he boarded plane for first time to meet Hitler at Berchtesgaden. German leader assured his only territorial aspiration was Sudeten annexation and promised that once that demand was satisfied, he had no more claims in Europe. Chamberlain returned convinced he had found formula to avoid war, grant Germany Sudeten region in exchange for guarantees for rest of Czechoslovakia. British Prime Minister, along with his French counterpart Édouard Daladier, pressured Beneš to accept cession. Czechoslovak president tried to resist, but without military support from his allies, had no real maneuvering margin. However, in second meeting, held at Bad Godesberg on September 22nd, Hitler hardened his position. He demanded immediate occupation of Sudetenland by German troops and added new claims for Poland and Hungary over Czechoslovak territories. Crisis intensified. Czechoslovakia decreed general mobilization. France partially mobilized its army and Royal Navy was put on alert. For few days, Europe seemed to be on edge of general conflict. In that conjuncture, Benito Mussolini proposed international conference. Meeting was held in Munich on September 29th with Hitler, Chamberlain, Daladier and Mussolini. Czechoslovakia was not invited, and Soviet Union was deliberately excluded. Agreement signed in early hours of September 30th granted Germany immediate occupation of Sudetenland, while Poland and Hungary would also receive territorial concessions. In exchange, Hitler signed declaration in which he assured having no new territorial ambitions in Europe. Chamberlain returned to London showing documents signed with Hitler and pronounced his famous phrase about having achieved peace for our time. He was received by crowds celebrating apparent diplomatic success. But at Westminster, figures like Winston Churchill denounced agreement as capitulation that sacrificed democratic ally for sake of illusory peace. German occupation of Sudetenland was carried out according to agreed calendar. German troops entered region between October 1st and 10th, occupied main cities and dismantled border fortifications. Czechoslovakia lost about one-third of its population and around 35% of its heavy industry. In strategic terms, it remained defenseless. Hitler had obtained complete diplomatic victory. With war threats and moderation promises, he had managed to legitimize territorial expansion without resorting to combat. Appeasement policy, conceived to preserve peace through limited concessions, allowed him to incorporate strategic regions and reinforce his international position. However, truce proved ephemeral. Barely 5 months later, in March 1939, Hitler demonstrated that Munich promises lacked value. Taking advantage of tensions between Czechs and Slovaks, he summoned President Emil Hácha to Berlin. Under direct intimidation, he forced him to accept establishment of German protectorate over rest of Czechoslovakia. On March 15th, German troops occupied Prague without firing shot. For first time, Hitler had annexed territories inhabited by non-Germanic populations, abandoning self-determination principle he had invoked to justify Anschluss and Sudeten crisis. Total occupation of Czechoslovakia revealed true nature of his ambitions. It was not about reuniting dispersed German peoples, but about building continental empire under Nazi dominion. The Pact of Demons, Hitler and Stalin divide Europe. German occupation of Prague in March 1939 marked definitive turning point in European politics. Promises made in Munich barely 6 months earlier had revealed themselves as temporary maneuver, and confidence in German guarantees collapsed completely. For first time, Western democracies recognized that appeasement had failed. Probability of new European conflict stopped being hypothesis to become immediate horizon. On March 31st, barely 2 weeks after German entry into Prague, Neville Chamberlain announced in House of Commons that Great Britain and France guaranteed Poland's independence. That declaration constituted radical change regarding British prudence line that had avoided direct military commitments on continent since Great War's end. However, this turn contained insurmountable contradiction. Western powers lacked practical means to defend Poland in case of attack. Geography converted Poland into isolated country regarding its new allies. No common borders existed with France or Great Britain, and only possibility of direct support passed through Baltic Sea, dominated by German aviation and navy. Land route through Soviet Union was even more problematic, since relations between Warsaw and Moscow were marked by mutual distrust. For Polish leaders, memory of Polish-Soviet War of 1920 weighed more than any abstract threat. Memory of Red Army reaching Warsaw's gates had consolidated conviction that Moscow was as dangerous as Berlin. Marshal Edward Rydz-Śmigły, Polish Army Commander-in-Chief, expressed it clearly by declaring that, regardless of circumstances, Poland will not allow entry of Soviet troops into its territory. During spring 1939, British and French diplomats tried to forge agreement with Soviet Union to contain Germany, but negotiations were characterized by slowness and lack of decision. Moscow demanded that any pact include right of Soviet intervention in Baltic states and Poland in case of German threat. This condition proved unacceptable for Warsaw and difficult to digest for London and Paris, who feared giving Stalin carte blanche over regions that had formed part of Russian Empire. Distrust was aggravated by Western delegations' attitude. British and French representatives travelled to Moscow by ship, taking several days to arrive, and lacked full authority to commit their governments. Soviets interpreted this behaviour as lack of seriousness and compared Western slowness with Germany's diplomatic movement speed in previous crises. Impression installed in Moscow was that democratic powers sought Soviet Union to bear main weight of eventual war, while they remained at distance. In this context, Stalin decided to explore strategic turn. On May 3rd, he replaced his Foreign Affairs Commissar Maxim Litvinov, identified with approach to West policy, and replaced him with Vyacheslav Molotov, man of absolute confidence and much more pragmatic. This change of faces sent unequivocal signal. Moscow was disposed to seriously consider understanding with Hitler. For Stalin, pact with Germany offered immediate advantages. It would allow him to gain time to complete Red Army modernization, weakened by late 30s purges that had eliminated good part of its experienced officer corps. It also opened possibility of recovering territories that had formed part of Tsarist Empire, Eastern Poland, Baltic states, Finland and Bessarabia. Initial contacts were presented under form of commercial agreements. Germany needed oil, grains, cotton and metals that Soviet Union could supply abundantly. In exchange, Moscow sought industrial machinery and military technology. Conversations advanced rapidly during summer 1939, when Hitler had already decided that Poland invasion should begin before winter. Military calendar required neutralizing any risk of two-front war, and for this it was essential to assure Soviet passivity. On August 23, 1939, German Foreign Affairs Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop arrived in Moscow and signed along with Molotov non-aggression treaty. Process speed contrasted with parsimony of negotiations with London and Paris. Pact included public clauses and secret protocols. In official part, both parties committed not to attack each other nor support third countries that would do so. In confidential part, division of Eastern Europe into spheres of influence was delineated. According to protocols, Poland would be divided along line that approximately followed Narew, Vistula and San rivers. Estonia, Latvia and Finland remained under Soviet influence, while Lithuania was initially assigned to Germany, although later delimitation would be modified. Romania also entered equation, with Bessarabia region marked as Soviet interest. In practice, Hitler and Stalin had agreed on Poland's destruction and Central Europe map redefinition without Western powers' participation. pact surprised world public opinion. For years, Nazism and communism had presented themselves as absolute ideological enemies. European communist parties, which had denounced fascism as supreme threat, received orders from Moscow to change discourse overnight and present imminent war as conflict between imperialist powers. For Hitler, pact eliminated main obstacle to military operation he had planned. For Stalin, it represented territorial expansion opportunity without immediate cost. On September 1, 1939, Germany launched Poland invasion, baptized as Fall Weiss. From dawn, Luftwaffe bombed Polish air bases, railway stations and cities. German army penetrated from multiple directions. Army Group North advanced from East Prussia toward Warsaw and Polish corridor, while Army Group South did so from Silesia and Slovakia toward Krakow and Lublin. Coordination between armor and aviation demonstrated effectiveness of new lightning war doctrine. Polish army lacked means to face this offensive. Its aviation was largely destroyed on ground during first days. Tanks were scarce and obsolete, and military doctrine remained based on World War I experiences. Despite tenacious resistance in several local battles, overwhelming was inevitable. Supposed Polish attack against Gleiwitz radio station, actually organized by disguised German agents, served as propaganda pretext to justify aggression. On September 3rd, in fulfillment of their guarantees, Great Britain and France declared war on Germany. However, they did not undertake significant offensive operations on Western Front. France mobilized its armies behind Maginot Line and limited itself to minor patrols in Saar, while Great Britain deployed its expeditionary force gradually. This inactivity, known as phony war, allowed Germany to concentrate all its energies on Polish campaign. On September 17th, Red Army crossed eastern border in application of Pact's secret protocols. Soviet invasion was officially justified as action to protect Ukrainian and Belarusian minorities after Polish state collapse. In reality, it meant literal execution of division agreed in Moscow. Polish resistance remained without options. Warsaw capitulated on September 27th after devastating siege, and last organized Polish units surrendered at Koch on October 6th. Poland partition was executed according to pact. Germany directly incorporated Poznan, Silesia, and Danzig corridor, besides Warsaw and country centre under general government, civil administration subjected to military occupation. Soviet Union annexed eastern Poland, which was integrated to Soviet republics of Ukraine and Belarus. In both zones, systematic repression policy against political, military, and intellectual elites began immediately. Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was not limited to allowing Poland's destruction. During following months, Soviet Union pressured Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania to accept mutual assistance treaties that included establishment of Soviet military bases. In November 1939, Moscow demanded territorial concessions from Finland. After Helsinki's refusal, Red Army initiated winter war. At same time in south, Stalin advanced his positions over Bessarabia. For Germany, agreement meant temporary strategic security. Eastern border was secured and Soviet supplies began flowing, oil, grains, cotton and metals that allowed resisting British naval blockade. For Stalin, pact represented cynical calculation: remain on sidelines while capitalist powers wore down in prolonged war, expanding at same time Soviet influence over territories he considered legitimately his own. However, under pact's apparent solidity, irreconcilable contradictions were hidden. Hitler had never abandoned his vision of war against Bolshevism as final objective. Stalin deeply distrusted Germany and used agreement as provisional measure to gain time. Pact of Demons was, in essence, marriage of convenience between two regimes that were preparing, consciously or unconsciously, to face each other in future.